And I see the room filling up, so let's rock and roll. We're delighted you were able to join us today to talk about nothing other than navigating the regulatory expectations under the client focus reforms. We've been doing these webinars on this very topic for some time, and quite honestly, we were waiting and waiting and waiting for these new guidelines, new guidance pieces to come out to illuminate what we've been observing in the marketplace working with our clients. So we've brought this wonderful group here together to dig in, identify opportunities for continuous improvements across our clients. And having said that, I'm sure it's been a windy road for many. If you have questions throughout today's conversation, jump in, ask away, and use your Zoom chatbot at the bottom here. It should be popping up on the chat dialog box to submit any questions throughout today's conversation. We are recording today's conversation and plan to share it with you following the webinar. And as always, reach out if you'd like to see any of the slides or any questions pop up throughout today's conversation. Without further ado, I'm going to ask our wonderful panelists to introduce themselves. And Nancy, do you mind starting us off?
Not at all. Param, thank you very much for having me. My name is Nancy Mirad. I'm the CEO and a securities lawyer of Registrant Law. And I've been helping clients tackle the client focused reforms since they were introduced back in 2021 and continue to do so. Our primary client base is, of course, portfolio managers, investment fund managers, and dealers. So I'm happy to be able to share some of my insights and takeaways from the reforms with you today and to hear from my colleagues.
Thank you, Nancy. Brian?
Hi, good morning and afternoon. My name is Brian Driscoll. I'm currently supervising portfolio manager with Designed Securities. I have been in front, middle, and back office of many different investment dealers. So I like to think that I have a very diversified experience, which really will help advisors with the challenges that are coming up.
Thank you, Brian. Kendra?
Hi, my name's Kendra Thompson, and I'm the founder and principal of a boutique strategy consulting firm called Epoch Advice. We focus on the future of advice and investing. We work on both sides of the border across all asset classes and models. We serve distribution companies, asset managers, the wealth tech companies, and the private equity firms that invest in them. And we typically work with the boards and executive teams on their biggest challenges and how to adopt for growth.
Thank you, Kendra, and welcome. Christopher Somerville.
Thanks, Param. My name is Chris Somerville. I'm a partner at the law firm Affleck Green McMurtry in Toronto. I'm a litigation lawyer, and for the past 15 years, my main area of expertise has been securities litigation and regulatory enforcement. There's nothing more satisfying to me than helping out investment dealers and advisors in a jam.
Thank you, Chris. And as you can tell, folks, we've got folks from all across areas of expertise, sides of the business. And my name is Parm. I'll be moderating today's panel discussion. And for those of you who haven't come across InvestorCom, we are a leading North American regulatory software provider for wealth and asset managers across North America. I'll say this and I'll stop our advertisements, but our award-winning platform is known for its intuitive solutions, helping eliminate compliance risk and foster growth for our clients. With that said, let's jump into the agenda for today. We want to start us off with a high-level overview of uh, what was coined 31368. What signals are we seeing? Are there any areas of improvement at a 10,000-foot level? Then we'll zoom in on firm and rep specific requirements around KYP, range of reasonable alternatives, and documentation best practices. And towards the end of the conversation, we'll have a high-level strategic view of how do you balance these requirements, between compliance and growth. Having said that, always, 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 please engage in the conversation using the chat box and ask questions for our panelists. And we've allotted 15 minutes at the end of the session to take up any conversation pieces that pop up. Fantastic. I'll take a deep breath and let's jump in. Nancy, can we start with you and perhaps let's begin with an overview of the findings. What's a couple of key practical takeaways that stood out to you?
Yeah, so I think, first, the principal practical takeaways from 368 for me, Param, are the way that it dramatically sharpens the regulatory expectations around how firms are actually operationalizing KYC, KYP, and suitability under the CFRs. I think what's new that I saw was the level of specificity and the number of concrete examples that the CSA and CIRO give of what is good or what bad might look like under the CFRs. And I think it's really important for firms to be conducting a thorough gap analysis of their processes against what's in the report. Second, and this is, I think, the best part of the report for me, was that there's a strong emphasis on centralization and efficiency at the firm level. So the CSA is clearly encouraging, the CSA and CIRO, the regulators are clearly encouraging firms to build centralized systems and analyses. And that's fantastic because what I think is it gives an opportunity for firms to strengthen their compliance and also reduce unnecessary duplication by requiring, the wheel to be reinvented for every client. Um, Third, I think documentation of firm processes was a major theme in the report. The report does include towards the end a detailed list of what firms' CFR processes should look like. And there's a lot of emphasis on describing the steps and processes that must be undertaken to comply with what might be in your policy. So, for example, how is KYC collected? How is a meaningful interaction with a client ensured? So I think the message here is really clear that firms need documented, assigned, and defensible processes, not just informal processes or a regurgitation of the rules. And lastly, I think another area was model portfolios. And while this is not new, we did see it in the BCSC report last year. There's more details, and the report clarifies that suitability and KYP operate at two levels. So at the model level, when building and maintaining a portfolio, and then at a client level when selecting a model. So I think 3136 368 isn't about, new legal obligations per se, but it's more about removing the ambiguity and shedding more light in terms of what the regulatory obligations and expectations are in terms of how they are operationalized.
Nancy, thank you. That's a perfect overview. Lots to do. Um, Obviously, identifying some gaps still in the marketplace. And maybe, Kendra, this is a good jump off point to hear your views. When it comes to actually implementing, and given how much time has passed between the drop of the regulations to where we are today and looking at the exam findings, where is it in your respective view that typically firms underestimate that lift?
Yeah, it's a significant amount of change, and it would be significant at any period, but in a period where we're seeing so much other change and so much new technology, new process, and new possibilities around data, I fear many firms have underestimated the priority that this needs within their roadmaps or have subjugated the regulatory components of what this is going to take away from some of their broader scalability, usability, and storytelling oriented change for advisors and clients. Where you see, the direction of travel for almost everyone's transformations. It's around telling better stories, having a clear message, being able to describe value, being able to explain advice, and also being able to describe and explain products. That's needed from a client demand point of view, and it's obviously reinforced by the regulation. But what I would say is that easier said than done. And I think doing that in the context of shifting vendors and shifting data and missing data, not having documented processes is a red flag. Having to go chase that down means that you probably don't have the workflow in place. You probably don't have consistency across the board. So there's a pretty heavy lift here. And when I work with larger firms, certainly what we're trying to do is ensure that regulatory spending, the money that goes to make firms compliance, is being looked at in the construct of the broader client experience, advisor experience, growth oriented spending, and that we do not pay twice or three times or four times and or deprioritize things that really matter along the way. So it's a governance thing, it's an operating model thing, it's a vendor thing, it's way more than just a policy thing. And I think that's what's overwhelming because often the people that need to make decisions, that this might not be what they wake up in the morning thinking about every day. And certainly this report shows that maybe they haven't given it all the priority it requires.
That's so well said. I mean, totally relate to it. How often do you wake up and say, let me see what's stated in 31368 versus what can I do to actually grow my business, grow my practice in a compliant manner? Um, Along those lines, Brian, as you said off the top, you've worked on a range of different areas in the business leading to your role today. Are there any surprises here from what you saw? And are there any easy wins where firms can do a better job from a compliance perspective?
Um, I don't think there are any surprises. I like that there was a lot more detail. As Nancy said, there's also more in the way of recommendations. That is helpful. I did find that they focused throughout the different sections of the report on concentration and liquidity more than they have in the past. Um, Concentration, that can be a challenge for dealers because it can be either the manufacturer, perhaps it's the sector, or even the asset class, right? There are different ways to attack the concentration issue. Liquidity, however, I think more and more is becoming the focus of the regulators. Liquidity is a big challenge, especially in the OM space. I think the challenge in the retail world now is that the liquidity for two different clients can be very different, and how you manage a book, your book of clients where you may have 100 families and 300 clients. How do you manage that to deal with the liquidity of each as an individual? And I think I don't know that there's an easy win for that. I don't think the systems are designed for it. And I think that's where we have to sort of put our focus, our attention.
Thank you, Brian. I think this segues into the question I want to ask you, Chris. Obviously, there's a clear signal. You can even look at the stats that I had on the prior slide where further action is required. From your lens as a litigator or a gentleman who helps folks deal with some of that enforcement activity, what do you expect to see going forward?
Thanks, Parm. I have some bad news and good news. The bad news is that dealers, if they're faced with an escalation to enforcement arising from these reforms or the work that the regulators have been doing on the reforms, they should expect to hire a securities litigation lawyer for assistance if there's enforcement to escalation. That's the bad news. The good news, as a securities litigation lawyer, I can say that my belief is that it's not too late, right? It's not too late for firms to move in the right direction. Even if there's escalation to enforcement, I know that it's going to be scary, but it's a process. The enforcement process is one that can be managed. with advice, with good decisions, and just carry on doing the good work to try and bring yourself in line with the requirements, even during the enforcement process. And that process will provide firms with an opportunity to demonstrate to the regulators that they're on the right track or that they're going on the right track. And there's still a very good chance that an enforcement issue can be resolved if that's demonstrated to the regulators.
And if you get that call, you know who to reach out to, Mr. Somerville. Let's segue into our first poll question. I see we're almost at 100 participants, and this is a good opportunity. And if you can help me out on Kid, let's pop the question on screen. What is, oh, looking at CSA's exam findings, where are you in your CFR readiness? Wish we had Jeopardy music. I might as well just get some on my phone so I can play it in the background. I'm seeing the numbers. Let's give this a few more seconds. I wish I could play this video. It initially, a lot of folks were saying they're confident, and now what's leading is they're almost there, but trailing behind that is active remediation gaps. So let me give this one more second. We're almost at 50% participation. So this is a really good, interesting data point. Once, twice, let's end the poll and share the results. Can you all see this on your monitors? So pretty good sample size for the statisticians in the room. 45% are really just working on tightening the controls. Interestingly, only 14% are in the confident category, so plenty of work to do. And then what's most interesting is the active remediation. And I think that can pick from some of the comments we've heard today already. So that's great. A few more poll questions to come. Thank you for engaging in this. And again, we'll republish these following today's Webby. Let me close this. Let's move forward. Okay. So the next part of our conversation is intended in sort of digging a little bit deeper, turning the page to specific requirements. We're going to start, as Nancy said, there's sort of two tiers to this. There is the enterprise or the investment dealer set of requirements, and then there is what's required from the registrants or registered reps themselves. And so let's start with the firm level KYP requirements and the deficiencies that were outlined. I'll turn it to you, Nancy. Anything specific pop up here that caught your attention specifically, maybe around defining significant change?
Yeah, I think, regulators have been clear for a while now that, and they repeated this in 31368 that firms have to define what significant change means for their business. And because without that definition, then you're left without a way to clearly demonstrate how you monitor your securities or when a reassessment of KYP or suitability is going to be triggered. So I think that's always been there, and it was emphasized again in the report. From a policy perspective, I think a good definition of significant change is going to be principles based, but specific enough to be operationalized. And reflect what the firm's actual business model is and the type of securities that they offer. So I think that's really key because once it is more specific to the firm, then it'll be easier to operationalize effectively. And so the report does give 10 examples of significant changes that firms had identified, things like risk rating changes, costs, liquidity, etc. So I think the best practice here isn't obviously to copy them all, but to tailor them to your firm's actual product shelf and how the firm products behave in real market conditions, so it's more practical. In terms of best practice, I've seen in the market, I think firms are doing three things really well. One, they're pairing that definition with a clear monitoring framework. So specifying how the monitoring will occur, who's responsible, and how often it's going to happen. Second, they're clearly linking the definition of significant change to what happens next. So, whether that's a security reapproval, whether it's a KYP reassessment, whether it's a client level suitability review, or it's a client communication. So, I think that's key. And third, they're documenting this entire end-to-end process. So, it's not just a policy statement, but it's something that can actually be demonstrated in practice. So, the key takeaway is that defining significant change shouldn't necessarily be a drafting exercise, but more of a foundation for a defensible monitoring, escalation, and reassessment process.
Thank you, Nancy. And I got to say, it's been years of practicing this across our clients. And to your point, Nancy, it starts with that definition or awareness of what should we worry about from a significant change perspective. What we've worked on with our clients is the end experience should be as, I'll call it, behind the scenes as possible. So when that change occurs, well, the firm should know, and then that change should be communicated to the end advisors with their book of business where those securities are impacted. So risk rating goes up. Why sift through thousands of prospectuses trying to find that? Instead, it could be way better, way more efficient if that's all being done in an embedded compliance manner, in our view. Now, that's Parham's opinion working at InvestorComp. Brian, you've worked on different sides of the business. What do you see as a best practice when it comes to those set of requirements?
Well, um, I think most dealers now have a fairly robust process for requests, reviews, and approvals. Um, I think the most important part of that process is not to cut corners. I think dealers maybe become complacent over time and skip things, especially with very common names. The well-known names, you may not feel that you have to go into as deep a dive as maybe you did in the past. For sure you do. For sure, the back office, so your product team, whatever you call them, needs to be diligent. They need to not let things go by that they you know feel are commonplace or not a big deal. Somebody has to look at it. Somebody has to analyze it, and I think if you're doing that properly, you will have a product shelf that is reasonably robust. It will be all, as you mentioned, in the back. So advisors aren't going to be seeing a lot of the back and forth. The advisors would need, what they really need is to know what is the dealer's conclusion about a product. If it's on the shelf, why is it on a shelf? Who's it appropriate for? What is the risk rating? That's the information an advisor needs. I think that's something that needs to be maintained by the dealer itself. As for what is a significant event, I think the old saying, you'll know it when you see it, really does ring true for a lot of this. Marketing firms have been, scouring newspapers for their clients for decades. I don't think it's any different now. If we're using the internet, we're using the websites, news services. I think it's just a matter of being on top of whatever's on your shelf and culling through it so that the advisors themselves don't have to do the heavy legwork. They can take the product and then work on that product. How is that appropriate for the client? They need to be, they're client facing, and that's really the approach the advisor should be taking. I think that, as I said, I think the process is already there. It's really a matter of fine tuning it. Take this report and compare it to what you do. Make sure that you actually cover all the bases.
Amen to that, Brian. Thank you for sharing. And sort of let's look at the flip side. Chris, what would happen when these elements that we're talking about today perhaps are not done or something goes wrong during the examination process. Any counsel or advice there?
Yeah, so I think I'd like to pick up really on what Brian was saying, because it's the other side of that conversation, and an issue that certainly can arise, which is one of concern to the regulators, is when there is not adequate interface between the dealer's compliance system and the advisor's activities in connection with their own clients. That's what I think needs to be documented, and maybe not documented as as much as other things that have been, more established in the past. To the extent that advisors can now start documenting the way that they're interacting with their firm's compliance systems when they're engaging in particular trades or transactions, that will really go a long way to answering a lot of the regulators' questions and answering enforcement activity if that ever unfortunately comes to pass.
Thank you, Chris. Um, I'll quickly pause. I know I see my colleague posted a message on the chat box. Folks, if you have any questions as a decently reasonable host, please jump in with questions for our panelists throughout today's conversation. On pause, back to our program, and I just wonder, Kendra, if we can double click on a few more questions your way, and specifically thinking about um, you know, given what you've seen across the business, you mentioned larger firms, sometimes smaller firms. I'm wondering if you've seen firms really embody this gatekeeping functionality that's now become moved from guidance to a regulatory requirement. What are you seeing there?
So maybe I'll like go up a level and say just like in general, the compliance element is different than what is truly needed for Canadians. And many Canadians really need advice, really want access to the markets, really deserve to have a rich advice experience. And the things that happen sometimes when we try to make these types of central client solutioning teams or trying to make it so that you can control how information is spread is sometimes we reduce the product shelf, sometimes we raise the bar for people to get access to advice, and sometimes advisors, whether it's implicit or explicitly, avoid doing things that might trigger a whole bunch of change. So I would just flag in general that it's very important when we think about what's happening here to really think about it from the outside in. And as a Canadian industry, we haven't done a great job doing that over multiple decades. And I think we're getting better at really thinking about the client experience, really thinking about the advisor experience. And that's what will be the proof in the pudding. The second thing I would say is that we have low adoption on a number of the technologies, and we lag other similar markets on the data elements that should make this easier to do. So you heard Chris mention, being able to understand what's going on between a client and an advisor. Like we're low on discovery tooling, we're low on AI notes, we are low on CRM adoption. We are low on front office workflow. We are low on front office collaboration technology compared to what we could be doing and what's technically possible today. And it's my hope that the prioritization of these types of regulations and this type of change will help make a case for broader adoption around the tooling in that conversation. Because at the heart of our business is that conversation between the client and the advisor. I also hope that we will focus on the operational elements that allow us to add innovative products, to modify products, and to continue to bring to the average Canadian democratized access to the markets. My fear, especially when I see the emphasis on things like liquidity, and I really agree with Brian's view, this brand loyalty that can come in when you're trying to avoid a misstep. I worry about competition in Canada and access for the average Canadian to the upsides of the markets. And I think it's really important that we balance that together as an industry. And then I guess the last thing I would just say is that like advisors are very change resistant and they have undergone quite a bit of change since COVID. They're getting better and better every generation, but I'm just saying, like, we have low adoption across that advisor profile, both with the in-bank employee models and with the independent models. And I think it's really important for us to make sure that we're really helping that adoption take place and that we are creating as much transparency, creating as much intuitive technology as we can, because this is not something that can be trained into advisors. This is not something that can be trained into their supervisors. And if we don't do a good job on those things, we will have some unintended impacts to the concerns around significant events.
Wow, phenomenal points, Kendra. Thank you. I just want to piggyback off a couple of things you said, and these have been some of our observations working with our clients. To your point, the degree of adoption often correlates with what we call the number of clicks to compliance. The higher the number of clicks to compliance, the dramatic drop. And where we have found success is, can we marry that compliance exercise with the advisor's day-to-day operation? So, do they want to look up a security to see how it stacks up relative to its peers? Can we natively document that analysis and house it in a centralized repository so it forgoes, the hindsight bias 3 years after the fact and looking at where is your analysis part? So try to be purposeful and proudly simple around minimizing the number of steps. Can we attach this to a CRM? Can we make sure the records and the documentation natively syncs with CRM records? All of those points, as you said, Kendra, are central, and we see market differences between our clients who have thought about that as an end-to-end experience to clients who say, all right, here's a new shiny tool, folks, go ahead. We've given you a laptop, and now you have access to this software solution. The degree of adoption and downstream compliance are absolutely foundationally different.
And maybe I'll just build on that. It's way easier to justify investing in that technology when you know you have primacy with the clients. This out um, uh, overwhelmingly benefits and leans towards firms that can justify that sort of whole relationship, primary advice relationship, and it can become a barrier for independents or niche players in our market. And again, that's part of diversity, that's part of innovation in our market, is to have independents and to have a specialist player. So I would just say, like, what that takes at scale, it is going to be easier to justify in a business case when you think you're going to get the broader relationship from the client.
Absolutely. Love it. Um, let's cue our Jeopardy music back on. We're going to jump into our second poll question. And Ankit, if you could kindly help me out with what is your single biggest constraint right now? Is it data quality, as Kendra mentioned? Is it advisor workflow adoption? Interesting results. Give me a few more seconds. We're almost at 30 responses. All right, 39 seconds, 42 respondents. Let me end poll and show everybody the results. It's almost as if everyone's agreeing with your comments, Kendra, around advisor workflow adoption. I know, Nancy, you touched on the same thing, same as you, Brian. Um, hey, I'll invite this, the technology tooling response. If if there's an opportunity to work together on that, we would welcome it. All right, 134. I haven't seen many questions come in across our audience. Again, folks, we've got a wonderful STEAM group of panelists. If you've got any questions for folks, jump in. Stop sharing the old results. And let's go a little bit deeper now. So we've talked about the KYP requirements largely at the entity level, also the individual advisors and plenty of examples outlined in 31368. Still doesn't flow off the top of my tongue here. Let's now dive into sort of the climax of that experience. You've identified your client's needs, their risk tolerance, their risk appetite. You've understood your product. Now, what about the enhanced suitability requirements? Um, Nancy, maybe we can start off with you again and talk about what are the key findings. This has been the biggest area of ambiguity across our client experience. Curious what you've seen.
Yeah, definitely. I know there was always questions, about, what the range of reasonable alternatives should be, and what does um, cost mean exactly. So I think one of the key findings in the report was that just, that costs and alternatives were not being captured as part of the suitability analysis. Advisors were doing a good job at capturing KYC and KYP a lot of times, but not the other factors. And so, and one of the emphasis that was in the report was about the fact that advisors weren't being required to consider lower cost alternatives available through the firm, including lower cost series or of the same fund or a fund with a lower MER for investment funds. So I think that was a large emphasis in the report, and the guidance was quite clear that where you have multiple series of the same investment that are available to a client, so assuming that the client's actually eligible, then the firm has to assess the impact of those costs in selecting one series over the other. And it also includes monitoring whether clients become eligible over time for lower cost series of the same investment. So, I think the assessment and the conclusion, including why a higher cost option was selected, if applicable, has to be documented as part of the suitability documentation. And I think in terms of the best practices that we're seeing, some firms are making this very tangible and auditable in a few ways. So they're standardizing their range of alternatives. So again, the report didn't give you an actual range of what's acceptable, which just means that you have to have a number that is defensible and justifiable. And rather than leaving it open-ended for your advisors to do as they see fit. And second, I think technology tools to compare costs across available securities. And lastly, it's where firms are embedding prompts into their suitability workflow so that costs and alternatives are in fact addressed and recorded. That way, you ensure that there's consistency and that advisors are reminded of this obligation each time they click, on a trade action. So the takeaway here, I think, is that reasonable range doesn't necessarily mean infinite choice. Of course, it means a defined, repeatable, and defensible comparison. And costs certainly can't be treated as incidental. It has to be a visible part of the suitability analysis that regulators can therefore see, test, and audit and understand after the fact.
Thank you. Understanding things after the fact, which is where Chris comes in. When evidence is provided that perhaps some of these elements that are identified, the consideration of costs, the consideration of a range of alternatives, perhaps has not been done, and investors are in higher cost products. What happens then?
Well, I like to see ambiguity as an opportunity as a litigator. And so if someone comes to a dealer and says, "Looks like you haven't complied with these requirements," dealers should seek legal advice before admitting any failure to comply, because there may be an argument that there was compliance, especially in an area that's novel and developing, and where I like to think that the regulators and the dealers are really on the same team. The regulators set out this, principled requirement and leave it to the industry really to decide how to implement that requirement. And there's a lot of room for experimentation and a lot of room for customization. So firms are encouraged to be looking at their own circumstances, their own business models, and building a compliance system that works for them. And if that can be demonstrated, then that's what the regulator wants to see. And there isn't a perfect answer. So just keep up the good work, like I said before. Document what you're doing, show how you've made progress along the way. And there, I mean, I can understand why these requirements can be intimidating, but I would focus more on the opportunity than the scary part.
Well said, Chris. Thank you. And there is an opportunity to, I think Kendra's saying the same thing, and so is Nancy and Brian. There is an opportunity to leverage these guidance notes, these regulations to directionally align your business with where what the requirements are. Um, One other point I'll just want to make clear, at least from what we're seeing in our practice, and it's around making that documentation practice easy. No one, I mean, you go to your doctor, who knows what the heck they're writing on with their scribbles. It's challenging to always kind of go back after the fact and say, hey, what did you communicate to your investor on this date? And perhaps that's your point, Kendra, around AI note takers. And I think, at least with our technology, where we see huge benefits, and I've seen the flip side of this working on the regulatory side. When you look at records 3 years afterwards, there is so much ambiguity. And so if you
Yeah.
can empower the reps to document their analysis, the corresponding data points at the time of the recommendation, which is what the regulatory expectation is, it becomes so much more defensible, so much less ambiguous. Um, any thoughts on that concept before we move forward?
Yeah, I mean, I think the greatest thing is that it's now technically possible. This conversation 6 years ago, we wouldn't have had the solution and the ability or the digital adoption in our industry to allow. So the good news is it's possible. The bad news is there's still a lot of work to do. But the idea of creating transparency and having technology to guide the actual conversation and to capture the context and the outcomes of those conversations and to make that available, not just in case of litigation, but even just for servicing consistency and storytelling to clients. If you think about where client reporting is going, if you think about where the digital experience is going, we are moving towards a much more on demand, much more story based, much more interactive set of tooling. And that tooling is becoming more and more consistent between the client and the advisor experience. The utopia is a single tool set that everyone's looking at the same thing. Of course, we're not there yet, but the benefit here is that the importance of getting this right, the spirit of the regulation is highly aligned with the spirit of client experience and advisor experience, which is people need to understand what they're being advised on, what the upside and the downside is, what the cost is. To Nancy's point, like this cost thing is a huge topic. And I do believe it's technically possible. What we have to do, though, is understand that not all players in our market are equally availing of or able to avail of that technology. And change takes time. And sometimes we have to iterate a little bit in order to get there. And so direction of travel is just as important as a guidance report. We need to know people are moving in that direction. I think to Chris's point, like don't be paralyzed by the ambiguity. Like sometimes I think it's important to be able to know that what you're doing is in that direction of travel and that you are trying to keep your team informed and you're investing for that experience. And I actually see that pretty consistently across the Canadian market that people are trying to do the right thing and they know that there's a big heavy lift still ahead of them, but that that they want to move in that direction.
Fantastic. This is great dialogue, folks, and thank you to our panelists. I see we're almost at 1:45, so I'll just do one more nudge. I see questions coming in through our audience. Please keep them coming. We've got plenty of time to tackle them. And before we jump into the lightning question round, I'd love to selfishly just ask one more poll question, which is our last question um, for today's program. What's the hardest part? We've been talking about assessing costs, documenting that cost analysis, and a range of reasonable alternatives. Mouthful. What do you think, our audience? Note to self, next time I will bring Jeopardy music, some background music. This is really interesting. I don't think there's one right answer here. Okay, we've got 40 responses, 44. And let me bring this onto the screen. Sharing the results. Interesting, eh? Knowing what are the alternatives makes sense. Access to comparable product data. I mean, Kendra just talks to your point about data. And then the supervisory burden and time in the workflow. I can't say enough about that time factor. I mean, I've seen before our clients adopting our technology, manual fillable PDF forms that say outline the securities you compared your recommendation to, compare how the standard deviation, risk rating, return dynamics, just I would personally leave the industry. That's far too much manual work for anybody, and per recommendation, that's far too painful. Really interesting results, folks. Thank you. And again, we'll share these um, as we progress through this webinar journey. Let me just stop sharing. And we're almost at time. We've got sort of less than 15 minutes. We've got a few more questions and a few other questions across that have come across our um, webinar here. So let me just start with a couple of practical questions that have come out. And the segment that we wanted to kind of jam into this conversation was really putting our future-looking lenses on and saying, how can these compliance requirements be balanced against the set of compliance burdens that have to be embraced across firms, or as Chris and Kendra, you coined it, that's an opportunity. One of the questions that's come in is, do you expect the deposit-taking institutions or the banks to, at some point, perhaps by way of these requirements, start opening up to third-party funds, as you know, perhaps allowing the bank branch staff to start potentially recommending third-party funds? Do you see that at all in the horizon?
Well, I have line of sight on a number of the advice strategies across our incumbents. What I would say is that for some time there has been a desire to create more fluidity between the various channels. So obviously there are channels within bank-owned firms that are already offering non-bank product, and then there are some that are not. And some of that is a cost issue, some of that is a compliance issue, some of that is a risk issue, some of that is a training issue, right? Like there's all different reasons. It's not just compliance. But I do think we need to be really thinking through whether we're asking our larger institutions to optimize for the legacy channels that our industry was created around. Like our framework as an industry is organized around the account types and products that we grew up with, or whether we're asking for them to regulate and to innovate based on what Canadians need and want. What we know is Canadians need and want access to advice, and they need and want access to the outcomes, and they want to know that they're known at the institutional and at the interpersonal level, whether it's a dedicated advisor or not. I think there's a lot of work to be done in that area that's, sort of simple advice, the sub 250 invested Canadian, and who's serving them, who's doing a good job, and what does that mean from a product space. And certainly cost of compliance and the technology burden and the employee burden are things that are being contemplated when organizations decide whether to stake claim to that market and what type of offering to do. And obviously, the risk is not just on opening up product shelf, it's also around removing advice, right? Removing dedicated advice or removing access to human advice or removing access to advice at all. And this is something that we've seen play out south of the border. We're lucky with the concentration we have in Canada that we're unlikely to see orphaned clients or people who are unserviced within our market. But in the US market, when similar changes and regulatory burden went up, we saw a wholesale exiting of certain service models. So it's about product and what product you choose, and it's not just because of compliance; it's also because of the economics. But I think it's also about whether or not you provide advice and whether or not you're going to push a whole generation of Canadian investors to self-service, which is not what they actually need and want.
Thank you, Kendra, and thank you for the questions that are coming in. There is a question, it's a bit of a technical one, and maybe Nancy, I can point it your way perhaps. And it's around everyone's favorite mouthful topic, range of reasonable alternatives. Have you seen clarity if the expectation is to consider just range of reasonable alternatives across your product offering, or is it all possible options across the marketplace?
Yeah, I think it's the language that I saw in the report is hasn't changed from previous language. It's still saying it's the reasonable range of alternatives that are available at the firm. There, I have not seen any expansion of that.
Yeah, I agree. And every firm who's adopted our technology, they want that range of alternative algorithm to really just push out what's available in my product offering to avoid the risk. And I think, Andrew, you touched on this. Well, I don't know how other products are managed, what their costs are. Why even get into that bag of quagmire? So the interconnectedness between the firm's product shelf and what available alternatives are considered logically, and I guess from a regulatory perspective, need to be interconnected. Um, let's just jump into a few more questions, and as always, folks, there's plenty of time left to ask our panel's questions. Nancy, going back to the earlier segment on range of reasonable alternatives, can we bring this to a bit more of a practical level? And can you share perhaps how firms you're seeing are tackling the requirements? Maybe with technology, maybe not.
For a reasonable range of alternatives?
Yes.
Yeah, I think, and this is where I think the report was quite helpful. I think one of the biggest challenges we as an industry faced with the CFRs is that there was a lot of ambiguity. And so even firms that were trying to do things right weren't sure if what they were doing was going to be acceptable. So that's always been a challenge. And this report was helpful in some ways. In some ways it could have been even more helpful, but it was helpful to our industry, and I think it put a lot of burden on our industry. And the report, however, did assist with that quite a bit. And one of the ways I think it reduced the burden was by allowing for centralization. And I think it's really important for firms to take a look at those examples because even in the reasonable range of alternatives, there's a couple of examples they've provided of ways in which firms can centralize their processes so that a registered individual doesn't have to document for every single transaction that involves the same security, their repeated thinking process so that there's more of a centralized feature, as long as, of course, you're following these set of parameters that are established for and it's all in the report. Like they've given the parameters that could be built into such a system. So I think and it doesn't necessarily need technology. I mean, I think technology is absolutely helpful, but not everyone can access technology. So there's certainly ways that it could be built out. And I think this is certainly a huge opportunity for firms to look at the report and see some of the ways that they can make their processes more efficient overall.
Thank you, Nancy. Folks, one more call out for questions as we're entering the 55-minute mark. Unbelievable how quickly time flies by. Um, Brian, maybe I can ask you on that same question, or the other piece that I think we received questions on prior to today's session was how is there a way to kind of define a poor KYP analysis versus a appropriate, compliant, and helpful from a client investor perspective KYP analysis at the end of the day? Any thoughts on that?
Well, I think the biggest challenge is that products are so diverse. One sector you can go about a very cursory review, and others may require great in-depth knowledge from professionals that do nothing but analyze. But as Nancy has said, that there are some firms that have technology, some that don't, some that have a full army of CFAs, and others that don't. I think that you have to step back, look at your policies and procedures and processes that you have in place now, maybe use this report as a checklist against that. But I would be worried about people who try and scrap what you're doing and look for the next great thing before really getting a good solid foundation. And sadly, I think as Nancy points out, some people can't, but I really do think these days that technology is almost becoming a necessity. I don't see how you can really look at the scope of product that we have available to us now without being able to use tools to screen it.
Well said. Folks, there's a couple more quick questions that popped in. I'm just going to ask everybody all our panelists, to provide their suggested best practice in two bullet points or less. Can we start with you, Chris? It's been a bit.
Best practice, know your own business. Know your own business strengths and build around that. That's what I recommend as a starting point for best practices because, the regulators will want to know that whatever policies that you have in place fit the business that you have, the types of clients that you have, the types of products that you offer.
Amazing. Kendra?
Yeah, I would really agree with that and just add on top, if you're thinking about where to invest or how to turn this into something that also drives growth, anchor in what clients need and want and how to deliver that in a straightforward, consistent, well-documented, and transparent way that you both understand yourself, but that your clients and their families and their children can understand as well. Because ultimately, at the end of the day, that is what clients want, and I think that will also make compliance easier here.
So well said. Brian?
I think it would merge the first two comments. I think you really have to know your business. And by knowing your business, it tells you, what you can do structurally, what you can't do. But equally important is knowing your client. You have to know, you have to know who your client is so that you can really target what resources you have to making sure you're giving the best solution to them.
Thank you, Brian. And our final word, Nancy.
Yeah, I think, definitely firms should be doing a gap analysis 100%. There's a lot of tidbits in there that are easy. If you are to be audited, they're easy, like low-hanging fruit for the regulators. So make sure you're doing a good gap analysis. A lot of what they've identified is easy to address. And if you've got good systems already, I think tweaking is probably all that you're going to need to do. If you don't have those systems, then yeah, there's a lot more work. But for those that are attending this session, I suspect most of you are interested in compliance and have been tuned into CFRs and have been operationalizing your processes accordingly. So I think do a good deep gap analysis and try to make sure you check off all of the areas that they've covered. Second, look at this as an opportunity to just make a better business in terms of even attracting advisors. From a business perspective, if you can operationalize and centralize your systems more, then you're going to make the life of the advisor easier. And at the end of the day, that's going to make the life of the client better too, because the advisor will have more time for his or her clients rather than of being overburdened by administrative paperwork and redundancies. So I think operationalizing centralized systems is a very good opportunity for some firms that they should be considering.
Nancy, Kendra, Brian, Chris, thank you. 10 out of 10 webinar. We finished just at 2 p.m. Thank you all for your time and have a great rest of your afternoon.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you all. I'll reach back
Thank
out
you.
individually. Thank you, Brian.